I'm Kelly Armstrong. I'm the president of Salve Regina, and it is my absolute pleasure to, again, for those of you who are with us this afternoon, to welcome you to Newport and to our Salve Regina campus on this beautiful afternoon. This last session of the forum was originally scheduled to be in our largest auditorium, which many of you were in, at Bazarski, but the demand was so great that we needed to move it outside under the tent here today. And it's a testimony to the importance and the significance that our final speaker, our final session, brings to this conference. With us today, we have Senator Whitehouse, Secretary Del Toro, fellow college and university presidents, Rear Admiral Walker, President Whalen, Rear Admiral Johnston, Salve trustees, faculty, staff, students, and members of our extended community, including our mayor, Senator Oyer, and many of our local leaders. And let me again extend a welcome to our Salve Regina University campus and to the 2024 Forum at Newport. Colleagues, when we thought about who would be the best possible public leader for a discussion of climate and security, only one name leapt to mind: former Secretary of State John Kerry. His public service, his leadership stretches across decades as a beacon to Americans of any political party who believe that service matters. You may know the broad outlines of his biography: his heroic service in Vietnam, 28 years in the United States Senate representing the people of Massachusetts. I am from Massachusetts, and I take particular pride in that. Nominated by President Barack Obama, John Kerry served as the 68th United States Secretary of State and, at the request of President Joe Biden, as the first special presidential envoy for climate. You may know that he helped negotiate the Paris Climate Accords, but you may not know that his earliest activism after returning from Vietnam was to help organize the very first Earth Day. Mr. Secretary, we are so very grateful to you for your leadership and for joining us today. And colleagues, please join me in welcoming Secretary of State John Kerry to the stage, accompanied by Salve Regina's own Dr. Jim Ludes. Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you. As a former staffer to you, the privilege of being able to ask you questions instead of answering questions. I know. We'll see how this goes.
All right.
Do you want to say a few words off the top?
Well, first of all, profound thank you, Madam President, President Armstrong, and to all the rest of you, Admiral Walker, great to be with you, Carlos Del Toro, a terrific Secretary of the Navy, one of the very best jobs in the United States government, once held by Franklin Roosevelt, and it's a job. I always thought when I was in the Navy, I said, maybe it'd be kind of cool to be Secretary of the Navy. But Admiral, I'll tell you, I descended on Newport, flying in from my college roommate's wedding in Chicago. And I got here in the morning, and I was reporting for duty to go to OCS. And God, what a rude awakening in the next half hour. As I stood there and, had to do up my button and stand at attention. And within about 15 minutes, I was shorn of all my locks. And I want you to know, some people have heads that are meant to be seen bald. I do not. I do not. And so the first Liberty came along, and I didn't dare venture into a bar in Newport. But I love the Navy, notwithstanding the war, which was what was wrong, not the Navy. And it's really great to be here with you. Sheldon, thank you. You are such an amazing champion of so many things. Nobody knows as much about what's wrong with American politics as you do, and you've been trying to fix it diligently and brilliantly. And I know everybody here appreciates your service enormously. So thank you. And Jack Reed is not here, but he was here earlier. And likewise, you are blessed in the state of Rhode Island. Not every state, gets a pair that are as in tune with not just the state, but with the needs of our nation. And Jack, as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, that is a really powerful position from which you can have enormous impact on policy, and where he does quietly have enormous impact on policy. So my thanks to Jack for his stewardship and service, and great to be here. And Salve Regina, thanks for doing this. I think, and Jim worked with me not only in the Senate, but he was the executive director of the American Security Project, which I formed with Chuck Hagel, and bipartisan, back in the days when we actually believed in it and thought it made a difference. And the American Security Project continues its work of trying to prove to people that security is not a partisan issue, bipartisan, common interests. We really ought to be able to organize ourselves around those interests. And it continues to do some really good work in doing that. So, Jim, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your service. So enough. Let's get into this minor issue. And I really am pleased to be here. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be on a beautiful September day.
Not bad, right? Well, so you mentioned the American Security Project, and it was 20 years ago or so that you were among the first people that I knew that was talking about climate change as a national security issue. A lot has happened since then, but what did you see then that so many others had not yet picked up on?
Well, I'm not so sure that it's a question of others not picking up on it. It may be a question of others not having a sense of the priority. But I think I saw the truth. I saw common sense. I mean, first of all, folks, I can't understate this. I fought in a war where the American people were lied to. And it didn't turn out to be the last time. And that was a period of time when the war was confused with the warriors. And it's a tragic thing that happened. And I saw that play out when I ran for president. I lost the presidency by one state, the state of Ohio. And as many of you may remember, my record was lied about profusely by the very same person who is now, and I'm not here to be partisan, but the very same person who was heading up the Republican campaign, Mr. Chris Lasagita, and others. And it's a matter of record if you talk to anybody on my crew or anybody who was with us in any of the action we saw. But a lot of people came out and politicized security and politicized fighting in a war. And that should never happen. Should never happen again. And I think out of that campaign experience, not just for me, but for a number of Republicans, came this sense of obligation and duty to try to set the record straight, not for me, but for all Americans, about where security fits into the interests of our country and how it is a much broader panorama than most people understand. Well beyond just the simplicity of an issue here and there. Everything is interconnected. And we can get into that in a little bit. But to me, it was a matter of, being true to what is the essential ingredient of democracy, truth. And if you don't have truth, if you don't have facts on the table, which we don't today, we have alternative realities put there purposefully in order to distort. You cannot save your democracy unless you fight, which is what Sheldon's been doing, for grounding of the truth. And that cannot be dictated just by the amount of money you can put on the table. America's dark money, and there's no bigger expert than Sheldon, has really stolen from us the legitimacy of the kind of dialogue that we should be having. And if you doubt what I'm saying, go read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Or go see what Bill Weld and I did when we ran in the 1990s. We had 10 televised regular debates in which we fought for that organizational principle around the truth. And to this day, Bill and I are friends and see each other occasionally, but with a good sense of what challenges the country today. So that's where I came out.
You're hearkening back to, it's not just a moment, but it feels like a moment when bipartisan comedy, right? It's a term that we hear around the Senate often. This bipartisan comedy prevailed. In 2007, 2008, there seemed to be a moment where there would be a bipartisan consensus around climate change. What happened?
Again, I'm not trying to be partisan, but there are unfortunately partisan things that have happened in the course of this. I'll explain it to you. In 2008, as we went into the campaign, something happened with respect to something John McCain and Mitt Romney and others had worked on and been involved in the past. And nobody vilified them for it. Nobody went after them because they were involved in working on the climate crisis. And so John became a cohort of mine in this endeavor, and he helped to draft legislation which mirrored legislation in the House of Representatives that approached the climate issue as a market-based solution, which we actually took from the American Enterprise Institute. It was market-based, called cap and trade. You would cap the amount of emissions you're doing, but you could trade those emissions. They had a value, and the marketplace would help decide what the value was to reducing those emissions. So that's what we did to cure acid rain. When I was Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, I gained a nickname as the Acid Rain King because Michael Dukakis gave me this one big job of chairing the governor's task force on acid rain. So I worked with Dick Celeste, the Democratic governor of Ohio. I worked with John Sununu, the Republican governor of New Hampshire. And we all came together around a solution, which was using this market-based approach. And when I went to the Senate in the 80s, I was privileged, in early 90 when we did the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act, to bring that economic approach to the table. It was accepted as an amendment, and it is the way in which you now don't hear about acid rain, because it works. Yeah. So Lindsey Graham, John McCain, a few others joined us in this effort to do this for CO2 emissions. And tragically, it was politicized. In the summer of 2008, you'll recall that Sarah Palin appeared on the scene, and people started to blast cap and trade, go after it and politicize it, make it the third rail of American politics. Find a vulnerability, and if you can't find it, create a vulnerability. And that's exactly what happened. And it was the beginning of a very difficult period. You can mark that together with 1994 when Newt Gingrich did the Contract for America. And you began to feel that something else was happening in American politics. I distinctly remember the United States Senate changed in 1994 and 95. And the bipartisanship that had characterized much of what we did disappeared. I can remember with Teddy Kennedy, we used to have a dinner over at his house in Virginia, and Orrin Hatch was there, and John Warner of Virginia, and Mac Mathias of Maryland. And we'd sit around, have a good time, tell some stories, laugh, and go to the Senate the next day and maybe pick up on some of the things we'd talked about and worked on. That doesn't happen today. And in 2008, in 2009, when Barack Obama came in, we had a moment where we thought we could get something done. That's when John McCain and Lindsey and everybody came on board. Lindsey was our partner, Joe Lieberman, myself, and Lindsey Graham. And we put this idea on the table. We began to inch away and get people, coming on board. We got up to about 55 votes. And we had the environment community at the table, the faith-based community. We had the Nuclear folks were at the table. The electricity producers and power guys were at the table. The broad-based environmental community and the NGOs were at the table. And we really were building a head of steam when Lindsey Graham was subjected to $800,000 being spent against him in South Carolina by a company called Peabody Coal out in the Midwest. And they savaged him. I mean, savaged him, even to the point that, you know, rumors about personal life and other things were appearing in the newspapers and going after him. On a Saturday morning, I got a call from Lindsey Graham, grown man, United States Senator, powerful, and he was crying in tears, ripped apart by what they were doing to him down in South Carolina. He said, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this. And he said, I got to pull out. And he called Lieberman, and he got out the next day. So we went to this new fight, Jim, which is still characterizing where we are, where we don't look for truth, we don't look for the bipartisanship, we don't look for the solution, we look for the politics. We look for the way to savage somebody and win the political edge. And America, writ large, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, is hurt by that. And we are hurt by, I tell you, I still travel abroad a lot. I'm still working on climate in a very significant way. And I just hear this from everybody around the world. What's the matter with you guys? What's happening to you? You're gridlocked, you're stuck, you don't make decisions, you can't move. And all you need to do, if you want to get a real measure of where we are with respect to the infrastructure necessary to win the battle against the climate crisis, just look at any airport in the Middle East or in Asia or anywhere else and compare it to JFK or LaGuardia or anywhere else in our country. We're just not doing it, folks. We're spending all our time squabbling, not leading, and not doing what's necessary to build the future, and particularly on this subject of the climate crisis. It is so much more, I mean, I listen to everybody, and you're Sherry and everybody, you get it. Threat multiplier, a lot of threats. But folks, I don't think we're about to have a nuclear war with Kim Jong-un. I may be wrong, I don't think we're about to, nor even Putin. And we see this delicate balance in the use of power with respect to Putin, where we give certain weapons, but not so much that we think he's going to deploy his nukes, and we have a conflagration. It's a delicate balance, which I think President Biden has done brilliantly, frankly, and kept the balance so that we don't go to World War III. But if you measure the odds of our actually having that war against the odds of what happens if the Thwaite Glacier, the so-called Doomsday Glacier in Antarctica, which is holding back the West Antarctic ice sheet, it has been for thousands of years, which is now, according to scientists, well predicted to potentially shatter in 5 years, within 5 years. And the impact of that on the planet for every single major city by the sea, let alone vulnerable nations like Bangladesh or island states, is totally existential. It's Katie bar the door, it's curtains, folks. And we have people today in the island states who are not saying, oh, help us reinforce our seawall. It's tell us where we can move to. And there are people right now who are debating over the status of those nations that are going to have to cede their territory but remain as a nation. Will they have a vote at the UN? These serious issues are being talked about. So look, this is not complicated. What's complicated is the politics in this atmosphere we're in. But the issue is simple. We are burning fossil fuels without capturing the emissions. That's the issue. We could capture the emissions, cost a lot of money. We're not finding the money, but we're moving. This is where we are. This is where people like me, Sherry, others, we're banging away because we're making progress. We're just not doing it. If you read John Doerr's book, the fellow who funded the sustainability school at Stanford, John Doerr, brilliant investor. He's been a strong environmentalist. And he'll tell you the two things that are missing are speed and scale. That's what has to happen. We can win the battle. So, I measure this against other security issues. 90% of the heat from the sun goes into the ocean. And the ocean chemistry is now changing faster than it has in millions of years. It's changing not just because of the heating, but the acidity of the CO2 that drops in the rainfall and other greenhouse gases is changing that chemistry. And the warming of the ocean is absolutely terrifying. It was 101 degrees off of Key West, off the Keys last summer. We've had 50 degrees centigrade temperatures measured this year in various parts of the world. And for those of you who know the wet bulb theory and what happens to human beings, if you're not able to process your perspiration, so forth, you die. And we're losing people every year to heat, to extreme heat. And over 7 million people a year are dying globally because of the levels of pollution that are in the atmosphere, which is all greenhouse gas pollution. It's pollution, folks. We used to call it pollution. And we used to do something about pollution. That's what I joined the effort in 1970. So we need to face up to the reality of this. The fires, the floods, the mudslides, the drought, the production of food, the interruption of that production of food, the lack of water, the melting of ice in all the glaciers of the world, disappearing in the Alps, disappearing, and not yet in Himalayas, but believe me, melting at an extraordinary rate, lack of water in Africa, and you think about it. We already have 30 million people a year who are moving around because they can't live where they live because of climate. 30 million refugees today. And I can tell you, because I was secretary at the time, and we had to work with Turkey and with Syria and others to manage the flow of all those refugees who were coming out of the desert because of the conflict and then trying to get to Europe, right? And if you follow what's been happening in Europe, you know that the politics of Europe were unbelievably changed by that migration to the right. Marine Le Pen, German parties, Italy, so forth. So think what happens when tens of millions of folks in Africa can't eat, can't drink, can't survive, have to move, too hot. Where are they gonna go? They're gonna be knocking on the door of Europe. They're gonna be knocking on the door of countries that have a lot of money and are taking care of themselves, but not putting enough into the global south. And so our challenge as a nation is to face up to this reality and define for people the benefits of the energy transition. And it's huge upside. We can get into that a bit if you want.
Yeah.
But I don't think people are taking, not enough people. It wasn't one vote, not one vote from a Republican senator for the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which now has 85% of its money going to so-called red states. 85% of the money going to red states. Not one vote for it. I got news for you. Even if the other guy were to win this race, there's no way those senators and congressmen are going to come into him and say, hey, get rid of the factory they built in in Des Moines or wherever it is. Not happening. So, we're living in a very bizarre and challenging time, but it's one we can win.
I want to talk about this upside, but I want to let folks know too, so when you came in, you should have gotten an index card. If you've got a question that you'd like to have asked, jot the question down on the card. Staff will come around and collect them, and we'll try to get to some of those before we're done here in a little bit. But you mentioned the upside.
And I'll be sure to show you how much I've learned about avoiding the question. Not true.
You mentioned upside. When you left government earlier this year, you talked about the amount of market potential to affect the global response to climate and the climate crisis. What's the market potential that you were talking about, and how do we activate it?
I think, Jim, thank you for that question. It's a really good one. When I left being Secretary of State before President Biden appointed me, I made it clear that I thought that no no government in the world has enough money to solve this problem. What government can do and should be doing is galvanizing action, bringing people together around policy. The IRA did that. The IRA is a brilliant piece of legislation, but it's not enough of it, or not enough of it in terms of the amount of legislation we need, and not enough of it in terms of the funding. So I believe the private sector will win this battle at some point in time. The problem is this, folks. The IPCC, which is the scientific entity created by the UN to track and manage the climate issue, put out a report in 2018. And it was a seminal report because it changed their attitude about where we are on climate. And all of these scientists, the best scientists in the world, thousands, several thousand of them, whose life is dedicated to science, which is a certain kind of discipline about how you gather evidence and how you measure and how you draw conclusions. Those scientists said to us, all of us collectively, you have 8 years within which, 12 years, within which to make the decisions and implement them in order to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. That was the challenge, 2018. It also changed the target from the Paris agreed upon target, which was we would try to maintain the Earth's warming at 2 degrees centigrade, or if possible, strive for 1.5. The 2 degrees went away, the possible strive, they challenged us. You gotta hit 1.5 degrees if you can, because everything else leaves the world in extremis. And so we tragically have not done the things necessary in order to heed that warning and do what we need to do. Now, we did set 2030 targets. And 2030 targets, we are still 6 years away. We have time to still accelerate our actions and to pick up our game. But we're not on track to do that yet. I'll just very quickly say to you. When we went to Glasgow, which was the first COP since Paris, the major COP, we talked about 1.5 and the need to try to move. We talked about doing more about fossil fuel burning. It was unmitigated. It's not per se the burning of fossil fuel. It's the burning of fossil fuel without capturing the emissions. If some CEO came in to me as a senator and said to me, hey, I can make this competitive, I can absolutely capture 100% of the emissions, and I can do it in a competitive way, I'd have a hard time saying, you can't do that. Even though I think there are repercussions to fossil fuel otherwise, but you'd have a harder time. That's not the situation. They can't capture at a competitive price. They're not yet in a place to be able to make that scalable. And to bring it, there's not enough money committed to that endeavor. And I've talked to, Darren Woods at ExxonMobil and, CEOs of these companies, worked with them. And again, we have to try to bring that, we have to get them and others on board, Jim. But the bottom line is this. Out of Glasgow, with all the promises that were made, and we brought many companies to the table for the first time, we created something called the First Movers Coalition. The First Movers Coalition has 100 of the largest corporations in America and best corporations. I mean, we've got, Google and Microsoft and Salesforce, Boeing, United Airlines, Delta Airlines, US Steel, GM. I mean, all these kinds of companies. And every one of them has put a bid on the table saying, we're going to buy green steel. 10% of the steel we buy to make our automobiles will be green steel, even though there's not a lot of it around. But they were sending a demand signal to the marketplace. And now we have those 100 companies still leading in the case of aviation fuel. FedEx and Delta and United all agreed 5% of their flight operations would be with sustainable aviation fuel. So the people who are trying to make it and now know, hey, there's a buyer out there. You got an offtake. And that begins to excite the marketplace. But it's not happening fast enough, folks. We need countries to come together. We have about 13 countries that have now joined this. We're trying to get cities and corporations to join it to accelerate the transition to clean energy. That's really the goal. If every promise made in Glasgow were fulfilled, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, tells us, hey, if you did that, you did all the things you said you're going to do, we would be at 1.8 degrees centigrade above normal. Can you imagine that? You know where we are today? We're heading to 2.5. When we started this travel, this journey, we were headed to over 4 degrees, 3.7, 4 degrees. Now, at least, they're telling us, well, if you do what you said you're going to do, you could get to 1.8. Well, guess what? After Sharm el-Sheikh the next year, if we did everything promised, we could get to 1.7. So close to 1.5. And I have not yet seen the measurement that yet analyzes what we could achieve after Dubai. But Dubai set an entirely new standard for what we could and should achieve. It said, paragraph 28, hard fought for over these last 3 or 4 years. It says that we all agree, almost 200 nations agreed, we must transition away from fossil fuel in a manner that is fair and equitable, and we must do so accelerating in this decade. You even got China to sign up and say we got to accelerate in this decade, and others, so as to achieve net zero by 2050, which means you're all adopting a target and a plan according to the science. According to the science is a very important phrase. It means 1.5 degrees. So that's a pretty damn good mandate, folks. And the key now, Jim, is to help get the private sector to embrace that and move faster. And regrettably, too many companies, driven by shareholder intervention, by the culture war over ESG and other things, which is totally contrived. I was going to say trumped up, but contrived. And it leaves us folks in a place where we really have to bear down and get the job done. Now, the other side of this coin, I know I've gone on a little bit, but the other side of this coin is there's a hell of a lot of money to be made, a lot of jobs to be created, and we're seeing that. The fastest growing job in America 3 years ago was wind turbine technician. The third fastest growing job was solar panel installer. You'll wonder why I skipped number 2. It's because it was nurse practitioner in the heart of COVID. But you think about that, we for the first time in history, more money went to clean energy investment, almost $2 trillion last year, than to fossil fuel by a 2-to-1 margin. Fossil fuel was at 1 trillion. So we can move this, but it takes all of you and a whole bunch of other folks demanding representation that wants to deal with facts and deal with the truth.
So we've got a ton of questions here. I want to ask you though, you mentioned COP28. You mentioned that language. One of your key negotiating partners was Xi Jinping from China. In the national security community, there's a tremendous amount of concern about China. I don't need to explain that to you. But I'm curious how you balance the competing, particularly in a bureaucracy the size of the US government, the competing interests and the competing views of China, where on the one hand, they are seen as a geopolitical risk and a concern because of the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea, and the Belt and Road Initiative would go on and on. But at the same time, they are an important partner in things like climate negotiations. How do you reconcile those two things, particularly when you were in government?
Well, we did reconcile them, and it took a lot of work to do it, I might add. And President Biden supported our trying to do that. But I think often what gets in the way, in our own way, in trying to forge relationships and do things that make sense, is the lower common denominator of American politics. And Washington in 2020 was a place where I think for less than the most thoughtful reasons, a lot of politicians were just banging away on China. It was the common enemy. Let's all bang away on China. We can blame China for this and blame China for that and so forth. Now, I am not Pollyanna-ish about China. I've been there many times, and I kept my relationship with Xi Jinping through the period. And the only place we got anything consequential done in the last 4 years with China was on climate. Where we went to sunny lands for 4 days with their team and ours. We negotiated for those 4 days, but we had previously negotiated in Paris, in Davos, in Stockholm, around the world, leading up to this moment. And with that moment, China, for the first time ever, agreed they were going to submit their next NDC, the National Determined Contribution, which is your reduction plan. They were going to introduce that. It's due this February. And China said, we will now include all greenhouse gases in our plan. They didn't up until then. And China's one of the largest methane producers in the world. You don't have a prayer of solving this problem, folks, if you're not dealing, as I said, with the facts, which is all greenhouse gases. So now China signed up to that. They signed up to creating a national methane plan, which they showed us in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they're now implementing. And methane, just FYI, if you want to start to really get scared, methane is 87.7% gas, and it presents a problem if you burn it, and then it's CO2, but otherwise it's methane, and methane is 20 to 80 times more destructive than CO2 in its early years, and about 20 or so in the later years. That's a fact. And we now have, because the permafrost is thawing in Alaska, in Siberia, various parts of the world, there's a natural, we call it fugitive gas. And fugitive gas is bubbling up out of the earth and in the ocean. You can light a match over the ocean where you see bubbles and it'll light on fire. And this is methane in that highly destructive form. And we still have oil and gas companies venting and flaring that flare it off, burn it off, which is the stupidest business decision you could conceivably make, because if you kept it, you'd sell it at a huge price. So, you know, this is the fight that we've been facing in terms of reality about China. There are real problems with China. Let me be absolutely clear. And I raise those problems with them whenever I'm there dealing. And they range from Hong Kong to Taiwan to Uyghurs to nine-dash line in the South China Sea, to Kim Jong-un, to nuclear weapons, to lack of access to the marketplace, to unfair rules of competition, to stealing intellectual property. How many things have I just listed? I don't know. But, you know, we got our issues with China, yes. But you do not, in my judgment, advance your interests of working these things through in a realistic way by just publicly bashing people and choosing to see who can out-rhetoric whom with, you know, it just doesn't work. So the one track where we actually had a conversation going was our track, where Xi Jinping and I had a relationship of 20-some years. And believe me, I've learned in diplomacy that pays off. The way we got the Iran nuclear agreement was in a room with Sergei Lavrov and you know, Javad Zarif of Iran and so forth. And we worked at it despite huge problems and differences. And we got an agreement that literally took the nuclear weapon off the table. Off the table. It would have been a 1-year plus breakout time for a nuclear weapon. And because that deal was pulled out of, without any real rationale and nothing to replace it, it's now about 1 week. I don't think I'm revealing anything that hasn't been in public in the print, but it's dangerous, folks. It's a far more dangerous world where they are. The IRGC came into power because it was viewed that the United States was untrustworthy, would not keep a deal, and walked away from the agreement we made. And we lost a huge footing in building up the security of the region and of the world. Now we have Iran with Houthis, with Hezbollah, with overt efforts against Israel, and it's a much more dangerous, inflammatory situation. So we need common sense in our politics, and I think in China. Let me tell you about China today. Because of the work we've done for the last 3 years, China's taking climate seriously. You want to know how seriously? Today, China is manufacturing and deploying more renewable energy than all of the rest of the world put together. They have cornered the market on panels, on turbines, on you name it, and we're not doing it. Now, let me tell you about what happens when the United States of America wants to do something. The end of World War II, when it was not clear for sure how we were going to absolutely win, this is about the winter of 1943, when we began to sort of really have a strategy and move it and implement it. I will tell you that by the end of that war, to do what we needed to do, to own the ocean, to own the air, to bust the defenses that Hitler had built, we made a lot of mid-level exec decisions and people went to work. And at the end of the war, every hour, the United States of America on the hour turned out a B-24 bomber ready to fly from a previous automobile manufacturer, Liberty Factory out in Michigan. Every hour, every 2 days, 3 Liberty ships, which were the container ships of that day, turned out ready to go. Think about that. So if we wanted to build solar panels today, if we were serious about wind, but we're not serious. We have 2,000 gigawatts of electric power backed up at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Backed up. We can't get decisions. And now we have lying about what these wind turbines and other things do, preventing us from building the power we need that is clean, while the rest of the world, Europe and others, are racing ahead. Shame on us. That's what's at stake.
I was going to ask you a question about the technology and innovation that we need, but what I'm hearing you saying that the question is not about technology, it's about will, political will.
It's also about technology. Let me give you an example. I happen to believe that we can't get to net zero 2050 without some nuclear. We need some nuclear, folks. And we have Bill Gates building a plant out in Wyoming. We have another plant out in Idaho. We're sort of tepidly playing around with it. Well, in Dubai, we agreed, we had a big event around this, one of the bigger events in Dubai, that we needed to triple our deployment of nuclear energy, and we needed to double our energy efficiency, and we needed to triple the deployment of renewables in order to meet our targets. Now, that takes a real stepping up, but I believe in small modular reactors. There's interesting work being done at MIT right now, where you can have a very small nuclear plant at very low enrichment levels, maybe 5% or so, using waste thoughtfully in ways that will not present you with waste problems in the long run. But measure your waste problem today. We've been storing this stuff since 1954 and before, the 1950s. I think the Nautilus was first, it was 1954, first nuclear submarine. I'll tell you something I proudly will say about the Navy. We got sailors living on board ships driven by nuclear power, and their bunks are not that far away from the reactors. We have never had an accident, we've never had a spill, we've never lost a sailor due to any of that. So I'm going to take that over the 7 million people who are dying every year because we're not doing something about the pollution. Common sense, we got to get back to it. And I think that's critical. So I think we can, with hydrogen is slower than we wanted it to be. It's a little more expensive yet still than we need it to be. We got to keep working at it. I'm for having a Manhattan-type project, folks. Maybe you saw Oppenheimer, and we all knew about that story anyway. We need a Manhattan project to move on these technologies, including the basic technologies that we know work, i.e. wind turbines, and solar. We do that, we can win our battle on the climate crisis. And believe me, America will be leading on the technologies that we want that will put people to work. And like America always does, we'll share that with the less developed world and with people who need to come along with us.
Sir, I have flipped through these questions, and there is a remarkable uniformity to this that is absolutely stunning.
When is Kerry going to shut up?
Well, it is. I think it's two themes. I'm going to ask you one, and then I'm going to ask you the second. But the first is from a Salve Regina University first-year student, Claire, about surpassing partisanship. On a more general note, what advice would you give to a college student going into politics to help remedy the dangerously polarized direction America is going in? That's one question. There are literally a dozen questions about that partisanship here.
So there is nothing in the Constitution that says the Senate and the Congress have to behave the way they are. What I found when I went to the Senate, as I described to you earlier, there were people there you could cut a deal, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. People looked for the common ground. Right now, there's no search for the common ground. There's search for destructive politics. And I don't know what people think they're going to get out of that, because you create a perpetual cycle. I think Americans are tired of the perpetual campaign. One of the blessings of what Joe Biden decided to do and of where we are today is this presidential campaign is only going to be about 2.5 months, and 2 more now yet to go. Hallelujah. So, but I'll tell you a story. Harry Truman was once a young senator sitting way in the back where I was when I first got there. Jay Rockefeller was to my left. He had been governor of West Virginia, and he wanted to finish out his term, to his credit, so he lost his place of seniority to me. And I'm sitting there in a seat that was very much similar to where Harry Truman was one night. And Truman would write his mother very frequently, and he wrote from the Senate floor, and he wrote, "Dearest mother, here I am in the United States Senate, and I see the ghosts of Calhoun and Webster and Clay, and I look over at colleagues and I pinch myself, say, how the hell did I ever get here?" And about 3 months later, it was another late night. He was writing home, and he said, "Mother, it's another late night in the Senate, and I'm working away. We're debating the great issues of our time. But I look over at my colleagues, and I pinch myself, and I say, how the hell did they get here?" So it's not a question. The rules of the Senate have not changed so significantly that people have to behave the way they're behaving. It's by choice. It's the way people, and you got to get people in there who want to fight to break the fever in our country and put our government back together again. Common sense. That's what we have to do.
So I'm going to end with this question, which actually does distill, I'd say, the majority of the other questions in the stack. I've known you for 20 years. You're one of the most optimistic people I've ever met.
20 best years of your life.
Absolutely. That's no joke.
Sorry.
You're one of the most optimistic people I know. Despite everything we've talked about today, and it's really easy to get subsumed in the darkness and the doom and the gloom, why are you still optimistic about the future?
For a number of reasons, Jim. Not sure I can describe them all or summon them all now. I'll tell you a little story, a short one. When I was finishing up being secretary in January of 2017, I took my last trip abroad, and included in it was going back to Vietnam, where John McCain and I worked hand in hand to try to actually make peace over Vietnam. It was we had amazing, this is a little longer than I probably should, but we had an amazing flight together, flying on Mil Air over to Iraq immediately after Desert Storm. And we were sent over by the president to sort of welcome the emir of Kuwait back and to thank the Big Red One, who had brought a lot of the brunt of it all. And we flew over. And John and I, by seniority, you get placed where you're sitting in the airplane. And John and I were placed facing each other. And there was still a little bit of sort of tension between us because I had opposed the war when I came back, and John, of course, was a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. And we didn't know each other that well. It was soon after he came to the Senate. And then we talked into the night, and the end of our discussion was, hey, we should really work together. We both understand that Vietnam is tearing at our country still. It's an open wound. We got to close it. We got to make peace in America to make peace with Vietnam. And the huge issue at that point in time was the POW MIA issue. So I was chair of the committee, and John was my wingman, and we worked to deal with putting the POW issue to bed, which required getting answers for families. No other way to do it. You have to answer families. And so we worked together over 10 years total, a couple of years put in the 90s with George H.W. Bush, General Vesey, some others. And we put together the most consequential, most exhaustive, most legitimate accounting for people lost in war in the history of human warfare. Go look at it. Right now, tonight, as we're sitting here, there are American forces on the ground in Vietnam working to repatriate people who are lost. So, I stood with John McCain in his cell in the Hanoi Hilton. We were talking, and he was telling me about what it was like and everything. And I thought about it. I said, this is really weird, strange. But here I am, this guy from Massachusetts, and here he is, a guy from Arizona. And we're sitting here together, conservative, semi-liberal, center, whatever. And, we're in the most improbable place where this guy spent, a good number of years of his life as a prisoner. And we together are finding common ground. And if you can find common ground here, you can find common ground anywhere. Now, I'll give you another twist on that. So in my last trip, which I began this with, I went to the Mekong Delta, which is where I was stationed, running boats up and down these rivers. And I met a guy, they had found a guy who legitimately was double-checked to have been in the sapper unit that was trained to go after us. They'd ambush us all the time. And one day, I had come face-to-face with a B-40 rocket, which was a Russian rocket, that blew out all our windows and then was pointed at us, ready to take us out. And this guy that I was talking to was there. And he talked about it. And he told me how they were trained and what they were. And this is, 40-some years, I can't, some amazing number of years later. But here we are, two guys who were trying to kill each other. And would have in an instant, standing and talking on a dock about our mutual efforts to try to save the Mekong Delta now, which was undergoing environmental devastation because of the rise of sea level and their bad fishing practices and so forth. And we found that common ground again. So I just have deeply in me a sense that all these problems are human. We're creating the problem. We're the ones burning the fossil fuel. Could we stop? Yes. Could we stop sooner than we're planning? Yes. Are we ready to do that? That's the issue. And we have to mobilize our politics to sort of get things right, Jim. And that's doable too. And the last story I'll tell you, I'll end on this note. When I came back, it's been mentioned that I first involved myself in the Earth Day effort. And we didn't just bring 20 million Americans out of their homes all on one day to have a national demonstration about the environment at a time when, incidentally, you couldn't really see across Los Angeles or across New York. It was really soupy and bad. And so people understood that. The Cuyahoga River had famously caught on fire during that period of time. And so we mobilized those 20 million and created a political movement around the environment. And we targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress. We labeled them the Dirty Dozen, after the movie that was out by that time. And we did a campaign against them in their states, and guess what? 7 of the 12 lost their seats. You know what happened? I'm telling you, after 28 years in the Senate, I can tell you, there is nothing like colleagues dropping around you to stiffen the spines of the survivors. and that's what happened. So Richard Nixon, no less a non-environmentalist than Richard Nixon, signed into law the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection, Coastal Zone Management, Endangered Species, and we created, we didn't have, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States of America. So I believe being involved, taking action, fighting for things in a democracy does make a difference. And that's why I'm optimistic. And I saw how we've won before. I know we can win again. We just have to go out and do it, folks. Just do it. Good. Thank you.
So we've got our orders. Secretary John Kerry.
Thank you. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hope that was according to what you wanted.